Hello. I want us to look at research instruments. As you recall, I had already shared with you questionnaires as one of the research instruments. Today, I want us to have a discussion about yet another important method of data collection or research instrument called interview. In this discussion, we want to take time to understand what an interview is as a method of data collection. We'll also look at the various types of interviews. We'll then attempt to understand what makes interviews suitable over other instruments or methods of data collection. We'll also spare time to understand or have a discussion about the weaknesses or drawbacks of interviews as a method of data collection. We will conclude our discussion by focusing on the administration of interview. How do we collect data through interviews? Interview is an important method of data collection or research instrument, just like questionnaire and others that we are still going to discuss. In that case, I want to ask you to pay a lot of attention to this discussion, and as usual, I want to urge you to take note of any issue that you wish further discussions is done on. Welcome. An interview can basically be understood as a conversation between two or more people where questions are asked by the interviewer to elicit facts or statements from the interviewee. It is designed to enable the respondents to provide information, views, opinion, and feelings on a given subject. Interviews may be confined to one individual, that is, one-on-one interview, or an interview can be extended to several people at the same time. If we look at this meaning that has been given on interview, one issue that comes out clear is that an interview is generally a conversation, but a conversation with an objective of establishing certain facts, and these facts relate to information, views, opinion, and feelings that people may have on a given issue that the researcher intends to research on. So this is an important instrument that is also used to complement other research instruments. Interviews come in many types. One of them is called structured interview. Structured interview involves tight control over the format of questions and answers. And in this case, the researcher has a predetermined list of questions which are presented to the respondents. The respondents are required to restrict their responses to the questions provided. This type of interview is generally rigid and standardized, and also fairly formal. Structured interviews are suitable in studies where large volumes of data is to be collected from many respondents. So that when we talk about structured interview, basically what we mean is that before the researcher starts to seek opinion of the respondents, the researcher must have a predetermined number or list of questions. And when he or she uses structured interview, the researcher is not allowed to ask additional questions outside what he or she had prescribed to ask. Again, the respondents are also advised to stick to the questions that have been asked and not to digress to other issues, because a structured interview is rigid. It does not permit a lot of flexibility like the other types of interview that we're shortly going to have a discussion on. So if you have a given number of questions which you have set aside before the onset of the interview, and which you direct the respondents and seek and also advise the respondents to respond to them in a strict manner, then that interview format or that interview type, we call it structured interview. These are some of the sample questions for structured interview. For instance, if a researcher was investigating cases relating to drug abuse among students in school, so some of the possible or sample questions that a researcher may use and which we want to use to serve as examples for structured interview might be, for instance, out of 10 students, how many would you say are abusing drugs and substances? When you look at that question is asking for a strict response, for a specific response. That if you have a sample of 10 students, how many in your opinion do you think are abusing alcohol? So the expected response here could be 1 out of 10, 2 out of 10, 5 out of 10, and so on and so forth. The response is quite specific. The other question might be, another sample of a question can be, list any 5 types of drugs and substances that are often abused by students. Again here, you are required to specifically restrict yourself to 5. You may have more than 5, which probably you may have witnessed, but once you have listed 5, you have already met the requirements of that question, and therefore you may be requested to stop there. The other possible question or another sample of a question in structured interview might be, describe some of the occasions in campus where students most abuse drugs and substances. Again here, you are being told to bring out some of those instances. A respondent might say that most of the cases of drug abuse occur when students go out with their friends or when students organize their rites of passage parties, such as birthdays, or when they are celebrating a senior friend who has just graduated. So that is also specific. Again, somebody might ask, how would you compare the rate of drug and substance abuse between resident and non-resident students? Again, that is also specific. Lastly, how do you reject friends' requests to occasions that predispose you to drug and substance abuse? Again, that question is quite clear and very, very specific. The other type of interview is called semi-structured interview. In a semi-structured interview, the interviewer also has a clear list of issues to be addressed and questions to be answered. However, there is some flexibility in the order of questioning. The interviewee is given the latitude to develop his or her ideas and speak more widely on the issues raised by the interviewer. And the responses are generally open-ended, with emphasis being on the interviewee's elaborating points of interest. In other words, when you talk about structured interview, semi-structured interview rather, even though the researcher has a list of questions, in a semi-structured interview, the researcher has the leeway to ask additional questions, to ask more questions, or to ask a follow-up question. Again, the researcher may not be under any obligation to follow strictly the order in which the questions have been outlined. For instance, if a researcher asks question 1 and the kind of responses that have been given by the participant suggests that that response covers also question number 2 and question number 3, then it would be meaningless for the researcher to again ask question 1, rather question 2 and 3, when the answers already provided in question 1 fairly covers the issues that he wanted to establish in question 2 and question 3. In that case, therefore, the researcher would now jump to question 4 and others that he feels the response that have been given earlier has not been issued. Again, if a respondent provides some answers to a given question, and then the researcher notices that there are certain gaps in the responses provided, the researcher has the latitude to ask additional questions to seek more clarifications on the issues that the researcher has given. Therefore, a semi-structured interview is one that a researcher has a specific list of questions, but he or she is not bound to strictly follow those questions. He can change them depending on the kind of responses adduced from the respondent. Again, the answers being sought does not strictly restrict the respondent to answer them in that particular way. The respondent has a latitude to go beyond what has been asked, as long as it is considered relevant to the question that has been raised. The other type of interviews is called unstructured interviews. In this type of interview, greater emphasis is placed on the interviewee's thoughts, and the role of the researcher is largely to introduce the topic of discussion and then let the interviewee develop his or her own ideas and also pursue his or her own train of thought. And structured interviews is used when we're investigating complex issues, since allowing interviewees to speak their minds is a better way of discovering things about these issues that are complex. It's also most preferred when a researcher is interested in obtaining in-depth information about a particular issue. In other words, when we talk about unstructured interview, we are referring to an interview in which the researcher does not have a predetermined set of questions to put across. What the researcher has in mind is the topic or the theme of discussion, and then the work of the researcher is simply introduce the theme or the topic and then invite the interviewee for discussion. In this case, the researcher does not have any specific set of questions that he or she poses to the interviewee. It is up to the interviewee to give his or her thoughts on that particular issue in the way he or she deems and finds it fit. Most of the interviews that we find in radio or TV talk shows, they are basically unstructured interviews. What the presenter comes up with is the general theme for discussion. For instance, the political campaigns or a party's policies. So what is then put forward is for the participants in that interview to now provide their ideas on what they think about the issue at hand. So this is an interview that is largely used when we want to deeply understand issues that appear complex. Therefore, we do not have specific set of questions that we put forward in our effort to understand these issues. We simply invite the participants to give their thoughts on these issues. Let's look at some of the sample questions that somebody would pose in unstructured interviews. For instance, if we're investigating about drug abuse, we may just have a few general guiding questions. For instance, tell me about the state of drugs and substance abuse among students. When you look at this question, it is general. It is not asking students any specific question, but a general question, so that the students might now say that out of, say, 20 students, I think this number abuses drugs and alcohol. I think alcohol consumption or drugs consumption is high among male students or among female students, or the most consumed drug is this type of drug or this other type of drug. So it's a general question. Another one might be, how has the choice of residents exacerbated drugs and substance abuse among students? Again here, we are simply asking the students, rather than the participants, to give us his or her opinion regarding whether where students stay has any bearing on the rate of drugs and substance abuse. Again, lastly, you may ask, what is your greatest weakness or strength when it comes to drug abuse? When you look at unstructured interviews, what normally happens is you have broader areas and broader issues that you want to put across, and then invite participants to give their thoughts on those particular issues. What are the advantages what are the advantages of interviews as a method of data collection? One of them is that it's a good method for producing data based on information, but rather based on informant priorities, opinions, and ideas. It also offers informants the opportunity to expand their ideas and explain their views. It does allow researchers to gain valuable insights based on the depth of the information gathered knowledge of the key informants. In other words, what we're saying here is that it is easier to get greater insight of issues being investigated when we use interviews, the method of data collection compared, say, to questionnaires. This is because we are giving participants the latitude, the opportunity, the flexibility, and the room to express their issues broadly on given thematic area that is of our interest. And that way, it is possible for us to get a lot of insight information about what the researcher is investigating. So if we want to get a lot of insight on issues that we're investigating, then the best method of data collection would be interview as opposed to a questionnaire. Indeed, other instruments of data collection might also be even much stronger in terms of providing insightful information about issues that we are investigating. These are some of the sample questions for structured interview. For instance, if a researcher was investigating cases relating to drug abuse among students in school, so some of the possible or sample questions that a researcher may use and which we want to use to serve as examples for structured interview might be, for instance, out of 10 students, how many would you say are abusing drugs and substances? When you look at that question is asking for a strict response, for a specific response. That if you have a sample of 10 students, how many, in your opinion, do you think are abusing alcohol? So the expected response here could be 1 out of 10, 2 out of 10, 5 out of 10, and so on and so forth. The response is quite specific. The other question might be, another sample of a question can be, list any 5 types of drugs and substances that are often abused by students. Again here, you are required to specifically restrict yourself to 5. You may have more than 5, which probably you may have witnessed, but once you have listed 5, you have already met the requirements of that question, and therefore you may be requested to stop there. The other possible question or another sample of a question in the structured interview might be, describe some of the occasions in campus where students most abuse drugs and substances. Again here, you are being told to bring out some of those instances. A respondent might say that most of the cases of drug abuse occur when students go out with their friends or when students organize their rites of passage parties such as birthdays, or when they are celebrating a senior friend who has just graduated. So that is also specific. Again, somebody might ask, how would you compare the rate of drugs and substance abuse between resident and non-resident students? Again, that is also specific. Lastly, how do you reject friends' requests to occasions that predispose you to drugs and substance abuse? Again, that question is quite clear and very, very specific. Another advantage of interviews is that it helps us in getting in-depth information. Interviews are particularly good at producing data that deal with topics in depth and in detail. Subjects can be probed, issues pursued, lines of investigation followed over a relatively long period. This is unlike an instrument-like questionnaire, where the responses are highly guided by the type of questions that have been posed, and also the restrictions, especially where choices in terms of a closed-ended questionnaire, meaning that the responses categories provided are the ones that a participant or a respondent must abide by. However, in the case of interviews permit the participant to give participant room to provide more detailed information. Again, it also offers the researcher the opportunity to deeply interrogate issues. That's why the issue of probing comes in. If a participant gives a response that the researcher feels there are still further gaps that need to be established, then it allows the researcher to ask follow-up questions and to pursue a particular line of thought until adequate information is obtained. So interviews permit researchers to probe and obtain in-depth information. This is unlike an instrument like questionnaire, where a predetermined set of responses, questions and responses is normally given, especially in the case of a closed-ended questionnaire. Interview has also some limitations or disadvantages that I also wanted to spare some time and examine. One of the disadvantages of interview is that it is time consuming. Things like preparation for fieldwork, training of research assistants, and securing appointments with key informants can take a lot of time. Again, a lot of time may be needed to interview one key informant, which may have a bearing on the total number of informants that can be reached. The researcher also needs more time to transcribe and code interview data, enter and analyze it. So when we look at interviews, it indeed takes so much time. If, for instance, you want to interview, say, 100 respondents, it means that you must contact each of the respondents, persuade them or convince them to spare time for your meeting. After that, then you must again sit down with them and now interview them. Assuming, for instance, that one key informant is interviewed, say, for 2 hours, then it means that for you to interview the 100 key informants, you may need an average of 200 hours. Now, these 200 hours might have to be dispersed over a given period of time, so that it will take a lot of time to spread the 200 hours. Sometimes an interview that had been earlier arranged to be done to a given key informant, maybe because of unforeseen factors or emergencies, be postponed. And if a researcher were to postpone, say, 5 to 10 interviews that had already been planned, then again, it also means that the duration of the interview of data collection through interviews that have been set by the researcher may not be met. Overall, interviews is normally time consuming, and we've said that not only in terms of preparing for phase 1 and also securing an appointment, but also in terms of translating audio information into a written form, and then entering that data for purposes of analysis. The other drawback of interview is that it is not possible for a researcher to interview so many respondents. This is because of the logistical challenges and time constraints. How far can a researcher go in terms of the number of participants engaged in the study is quite limited. This is because you need time to arrange for this meeting, and then you need time to interview the identified respondents. So the very nature of interview, and because you want in-depth information from each respondent, it means that you have to take a lot of time with each respondent in order for you to get more information from that particular respondent. Meaning, therefore, that the more time you take with one participant, the less the number of participants you will recover at the end of the research period. Because of that, it is not easy for a researcher to reach so many respondents because of the challenges that I have already highlighted. In this case, therefore, interviews is only suitable for studies where a smaller sample is necessary, and again for studies where it is being used as a complementary research instrument and is not the main or the primary research instrument. It is because it is not possible for a researcher to meet as many people as is necessary. So the limited sample that is synonymous with interviews makes it undesirable in studies where a larger sample, maybe hundreds of thousands of respondents are required. So such studies, we would rather use other instruments such as questionnaires and of course not interviews, because of the fact that we are not able to reach as many people as the study would wish if we were to employ an interview method. The other drawback of interview method is the fact that the difficulty that researchers face when analyzing interview data. The semi-structured and unstructured interviews produce non-standard responses. And if the interview responses are recorded on paper, the data collected will need to be entered manually in data processing sheets. And again, data entry and scanning of data processing sheets can be very difficult and indeed daunting. So if, for instance, you were to interview as many as 200 respondents, and each respondent you took, say, 2 hours, then it means that you are going to document so much information, and therefore analyzing and synthesizing the information provided or the information provided by the respondent can take time, and in the process take time to analyze it. But data analysis of interview data is not just with regard to the amount of time it takes. No, it's also complex because the coding process of interview data is quite complex. It is not as easy as, say, data obtained through questionnaires. So data analysis is quite complex when it comes to interview data because of the nature of the diverse information that interview as a method of data collection generates. That diversity in terms of information obtained may mean that a researcher has to spare so much time to group information that talk about the same thing together. Then those that talk of different other things together. And that process of thematically arranging information obtained again can be daunting and also time consuming. The other drawback or disadvantage of interview method is that of inhibitions. An interview is an official situation where people are speaking and recorded on a tape recorder, and this can be daunting for certain kinds of people. Some respondents may also perceive being interviewed as an invasion of their privacy and thus upsetting to them. The identity of the researcher may also affect the respondences of the interviewee. They may opt to say what the researcher wants to hear and not exactly their position. Like it has been observed here, some researchers might feel, rather some participants might feel uncomfortable diverging information that they perceive as personal to a person they perceive as a stranger, because the researcher and the interview or participant do not have an established social relationship. The relationship that they establish is one that is common, and for purposes of that data collection only. In that sense, before people find it quite difficult to diverge information that they consider personal to an individual whom they have not entered into a very close social relationship with. So they may provide information that they consider as not sensitive and exclude that they consider sensitive and personal. In the process, therefore, it's not possible for a researcher to obtain in-depth information that would enable him or her to have a comprehensive understanding or a comprehensive examination of the issues under inquiry. So the presence of an interviewer might act as an obstacle to interview. This is unlike, say, self-administered questionnaires, where the researcher simply distributes them to the respondent, and the respondent responds to those questions in their privacy, and at the same time have the liberty not to provide their identity if they think that provision of identity they are not comfortable with. So inhibition is a major disadvantage that has been noted by researchers when it comes to the use of interview as a method of data collection. Interviews come in many types. One of them is called structured interview. Structured interview involves tight control over the format of questions and answers. And in this case, the researcher has a predetermined list of questions which are presented to the respondents. The respondents are required to restrict their responses to the questions provided. This type of interview is generally rigid and standardized, and also fairly formal. Structured interviews are suitable in studies where large volumes of data is to be collected from many respondents. So that when we talk about structured interview, basically what we mean is that before the researcher starts to seek opinion of the respondent, the researcher must have a predetermined number or list of questions. And when he or she uses structured interview, the researcher is not allowed to ask additional questions outside what he or she had prescribed to ask. Again, the respondents are also advised to stick to the questions that have been asked and not to digress to other issues, because a structured interview is rigid. It does not permit a lot of flexibility like the other types of interview that we're shortly going to have a discussion on. So if you have a given number of questions which you have set aside before the onset of the interview, and which you direct the respondents and seek and also advise the respondents to respond to them in a strict manner, then that interview format The other aspect is now the execution of the actual interview. Execution will entail a decision on the appropriate time, the venue of the interview, and the methods of recording the responses. Again, execution also implies contacting and informing the informant early enough for the interview, while indicating when, where, and how long the interview will take. Again, explain to the informant the purpose of the interview and assure them that their responses will be used for study purposes only. The other thing that also should be done is to establish rapport to the informant and make the interview as easy as possible. Again, make the discussion as stimulating and encouraging as possible by giving informants reasonable time to express themselves. Lastly, ensure that time indicated for the interview is not exceeded unless with the permission of the informant. So what we mean here is that when you're executing the actual interview, ensure that a lot of things are put in order. You must confirm with informants the time. Even if you had contacted them earlier, it is courteous to inform them again and to remind them again of the interview and the time as well as the venue. Again, inform them that this interview will take this amount of time. So in good, also as a matter of good faith, try again to remind the participant of the purpose of the interview and the kind of information you are seeking from them. Establish a friendly atmosphere also with the informants so that they feel at ease when they are now responding to the issues raised. When you are now asking questions, ensure that again that the atmosphere is fairly stimulating, and again give the informants adequate time to express themselves. Don't hurry them up. Don't shut them down. Don't interrupt them. Try to create an atmosphere that encourages them to speak freely and openly. Then there is the aspect of recording. It's always best to record through tape recorder. If the response is noted down, maybe in a notebook, it should be either noted simultaneously or immediately after the interview. That is, if you are writing down what the responses you are being given by the participants, it is important that you record it at the same time the interview is going on. Or if that's not possible, then do it immediately the interview has been done. Otherwise, it's encouraged that you do it at the same time when the meeting is going on, so that you don't forget certain issues. If you are to do this later on, it is possible that you may not list down everything as they were saying. The researcher should be accompanied with research assistants to help in recording and taking notes. Indeed, it might be a daunting task, asking questions, listening, and recording them at the same time. So, sometimes it's good that the researcher focuses on asking questions and listening, and then the research assistant note down what is the responses that are being provided by participants. Again, if you had sought a meeting, it is important to inform the participant that you will be going for that meeting with somebody else who will serve as your assistant. Because if that is not done, then sometimes the presence of another person whose knowledge the participant was not aware of might also obstruct and inhibit the participants from providing comprehensive responses. This is because they may feel that the third party is after something else. So, as a matter of courtesy, it's important to inform the researcher that you will be in the company of one or two more people and whose work is ABCD, and also make it clear to them that this is part of the research team that you will have, not only when interviewing him, but also in the entire data collection exercise. I wish to thank you again for listening, and also I want to request you to put down any information that is not clear, so that we may create time and have a look at them once more. Thank you so much.